Hello, beautiful people. In today's episode, I speak to the wise Nat Eliason. Nat is the founder of a marketing agency called Growth Machine. He teaches a popular Rome course called Effortless Output. And I first came and started to consume Nat's content when I just stumbled upon his website in March of this year, and it was awesome. He had so much good information on it. I'm not sure how exactly I found him, but I'm so grateful I did because I went through all of his articles, I went through his notes, and his newsletter is incredible. He just started posting on YouTube as well. This man does everything. In this episode, you get a look into his brain. Why does Nat Eliason do the things he does? Really enjoyed this conversation. Super grateful because I created this podcast so that I could speak to people like Nat. And if you enjoyed this conversation, let me know on Twitter at HeyDannyMiranda is where to find me. And feel free to sign up to my newsletter. That's Tuesday Treasure. You can find that at DannyMiranda.com/Tuesday. Enough about me. Let's get into the wise Nat Eliason. Here is the episode.
Interesting people, thought-provoking conversations, nutrition for your brain. Journey through the minds of the world's top performers and discover what it really takes to achieve your highest version. This is the Danny Miranda Podcast.
First things first, for people who don't know you, just give everyone a little brief background of who you are.
Yes, so my name's Nat. I'm the founder of the marketing agency Growth Machine, where we do SEO and content marketing for consumer SaaS and e-commerce clients. Then I write on my personal site at nateliason.com and teach the Effortless Output in Rome course for anyone looking to level up their knowledge management and creative output.
Yeah, man. And it's crazy because all of the content you've put out has really influenced me in such an incredible way, because right now I'm recording this podcast and I set up this podcast from your blog post, How to Set Up a Podcast in 2019.
That's great.
Yeah. So, and then I'm asking you questions, and I've notes and research that I'm using on Rome, and I've been using Rome for the past 2 months because of you. So you've been a huge influence in my life. And so I just want to take a quick second to thank you for that, man.
Yeah, I'm glad I could be helpful. You know, it's always fun hearing that stuff is useful. So glad you found value in all of it.
So the thing about you that I find so fascinating is you're not trying, it doesn't seem from my perspective that you're trying to make money off people in the same way that I think a lot of people are. You take an approach of like trying to provide value first. And so I'm curious, is that something you've always had, or is that or is that a more recent development?
It's a good question. I think that at one point I was doing a job for someone where it was very aggressive sales focused, and it felt like we were providing kind of minimal value to then create like urgency and scarcity and not like fear, but a sense of like, oh, if you didn't buy our product, you would have a really hard time succeeding with what you were doing. And then most people who were buying the product weren't even getting much value from it. And, you know, they weren't getting the results that they had hoped for by like purchasing the product. And that really turned me off of that aggressive, salesy kind of like, you know, really strong calls to action, all of that stuff. And I think it just like left a really bad taste in my mouth, where I didn't want that to be any part of my work and my brand. Right. And there's always a challenge in finding a balance there, because a lot of those tactics work, right? Like creating urgency and sense of scarcity and sending lots of follow-up emails and hammering on people, right? Like it does work. You do make more money. Like you will have more quote unquote success, but it's kind of like, okay, at what cost? And I think after I had that experience, I was sort of like, all right, I really don't want to be doing things this way. I'd rather make less money and have a bit more of that image like you just described of like not being a hardcore salesperson for what stuff I do charge money for and then give away a lot of other stuff basically for free. It just feels better, and I think it's a better long-term strategy as well.
Yeah, I was reading your post about how this is how you don't have pop-ups on your site, and you almost wrote it as a way to forgive your sins, right? And I thought that was so funny and spoke to your mindset of how you approach the whole thing.
Yeah, I definitely felt bad spending a year getting everybody in the world to install email pop-ups on their site. So hopefully that trend is fading.
So one question that I'm curious about from just a personal point of view is you started writing online in 2014, if I remember correctly. I did my research correct. And it's 2020 now, and you've written a lot. But I'm curious about what you would do if you were starting today in 2020, writing online or coming out of college now. What would your mindset be, and what types of things would you focus on, and what maybe would you do differently? I'm curious about this.
Yeah, well, I started writing online in 2012. My main blog, nateliason.com, that started in 2014. But I had a blog before that that was primarily focused on good habits, productivity, those kinds of things. So I actually had that beforehand. And I wrote an article recently that was how to start a blog that changes your life. And it kind of goes through that whole journey from starting my personal site back in 2014 to now, and, thoughts on how I might do some of this today. But I would actually probably recommend people start kind of the same way I did with that first site, where it wasn't under my name. So I felt less personal pressure in terms of what I was publishing, right? Like I felt less embarrassed for anything to be bad because it was like semi-anonymous, and I forced myself to write 3 articles a week. So I put myself on that 3 article a week cadence for almost a year. I think I must have had, maybe it was like 6 months. So I must have had like 60, 70, 80 articles on it, and just forcing myself to get in that cadence was really helpful for getting over the concept of writer's block, for getting over any procrastination in publishing, for getting in the habit of like coming up with ideas and executing on them pretty quickly. It was really, really useful for just getting into that mindset. And then once I felt like I had I talk about this in the Change Your Life article, but like there's kinds of 2 levels or 2 mindsets you can be at with publishing online. One is you have a lot of resistance to doing it, and it's very difficult for you to hit publish. And then you eventually get past that. You hit a point where you actually get more resistance for not publishing something for a while. You start to feel like almost like a creative backup, where it's like, okay, I need to publish something. Like it's been too long. Once you get to that point, you don't need to be forcing yourself to put out a few articles a week because it's going to happen more naturally. But until you get to that point, you almost do have to force yourself into very consistent content production so that you build the habit. So that's sort of what I usually say is don't worry about writing like a really epic post in the beginning. Just publish like 100 kind of shitty ones to get yourself in the habit. And then you can always make it better from there, right? Like I'm starting my YouTube channel now, and my philosophy with it is don't try to make each of these first videos perfect. Try to make each one a little bit better than the last one and keep kind of refining the process, but optimize for throughput over like maximum quality. So focus on getting up to 2 videos a week, 3 videos a week, building a really good editing workflow, building a really good scripting workflow, doing all of that. And then, iterate on making it better and better over time. Don't try to make it perfect out of the gate.
Yeah, I love that advice. And it's certainly held true from my vantage point and what I'm trying to do myself, doing 2 posts a week. And I'm so happy you brought up YouTube, because I wanted to ask you about this. You're primarily a writer, obviously, and I'm curious about why you're taking the approach to go onto YouTube. Is it just so more people can find you? I'm super curious about why YouTube is the next platform you're trying to conquer.
Yeah, 80 or 90% of all time on the internet is spent on video. And a video on a topic will typically spread much wider than an article on a topic. Video is more engaging to more people. Most people prefer video to reading. And even though I am not one of those people, even though I barely watch videos unless it's really the best medium for something, most people aren't like that. Most people prefer video. And one of my goals right now is to kind of like increase the reach of my work so that I am more able to promote and amplify products and companies that I believe in very strongly. I've started doing more investing, and whenever I find a company I'm really excited about, I like being able to share that with my audience while also getting to engage a little bit with that company, either just as an outside friend, as an investor, as a mentor, whatever. And if I want to build up the audience more, then there's a ton of value in building something up on YouTube. The other reason is, there's a few reasons, right? One other one is YouTube can almost be like sort of like a Trojan horse in some ways. So the analogy I like to make here is that nobody starts by reading really tough books, right? You don't not read nonfiction for 5-6 years and then go pick up like Gödel Bach and have a good time, right? Like you start with easier books, and then you progressively get like more and more dissatisfied with pop nonfiction, and you work your way up to more challenging ones that provide more bang for their buck. In some ways, YouTube is kind of like a Trojan horse for the writing, where I can capture initial attention better there, I think. And then if my videos are very good and compelling to people, that might make them interested in actually taking the time to read something I've written. Like an article is a bigger ask to people off the bat than a video in most cases. And so YouTube is almost a really good top of funnel source of acquisition for an audience that can then lead into the things I actually care more about, which would be like the writing and some of the podcasts, where I feel like I can be a little bit more thoughtful. It's hard to condense a really detailed 4,000 word blog post into a YouTube video without it becoming boring and like without losing the watcher. And so there's some, YouTube is almost like the highlight reel of some of these posts that can then feed back into the longer, more detailed versions of them. So I think there's just a lot of value of being discoverable in a bunch of different media, a bunch of different places, especially if you can reproduce your work onto other channels without it being a huge additional time investment or energy investment.
Yeah, and you've created such a library of content over the past 6 years on your website that it's like you can just pull out some of the best ideas or some of the things that you think people will like on YouTube and just feed those out. And it's really cool to see a writer go from one platform to another and see the things that it's opened up for you. I was going through your replies just before this podcast, and I saw the artist Blau liked one of your YouTube videos, and I was like, this is crazy. Would this ever have happened if he didn't put out this YouTube video? So I thought that was interesting.
That was actually a really funny one because I've been a fan of his for like years. I've seen him live a couple of times, and then somebody sent him that video, and then he and I like DM'd on Twitter a little bit about it. And I was like, okay, that's pretty neat, right? Like,
it's so cool, man. Like, and that's the thing that would have happened, right? If you didn't create that thread or write that or create that YouTube video. And it's like the power of online is like when your favorite creators suddenly become people you're communicating with. It blows my mind. And that's what this podcast is right now. It's like, it's crazy how that could happen so quickly.
Oh, yeah. Especially on a platform like Twitter, where I find it's very open to people connecting with each other, kind of regardless of where they are. It's a little more like giving of a community than like Instagram or something. So I find that leveraging Twitter is kind of an underappreciated opportunity, especially for a lot of young people or people early in their career.
So what are ways that someone could leverage Twitter? Is it just to put out good work? Is it just to like what are the ways you would think about leveraging Twitter?
I think there's a few pieces to it. One is just starting out by like finding everybody on it who you respect or look up to or are curious about what they're doing, following all of them, and then just like engaging with what they're doing, right? It can be as simple as liking stuff or, occasionally replying to it, finding ways to add value, retweeting things that they put out, like just lightly popping yourself onto their radar over time and like supporting what they're doing there is a very simple way to just like slowly build a relationship, because you're not like asking for anything, you're helping them, and they're going to become familiar with you over time. And as you do more and more of that, you can get to the point of like actually having a small ask, like asking a question or sending a follow-up to a tweet with a question, sending them a DM. Like there's a lot of ways you can slowly create value for other people before you ask for anything. And a lot of young people have done a really great job of that. I mean, Brandon Zhang comes to mind, right? I was on his podcast the other day, and he's like a freshman at Columbia, and he's just been hitting up like everybody in the Twitter sphere, asking them good questions, inviting them on his podcast, and been like able to network with a lot of fairly like influentially tech and startup and whatever people, just by like being polite, asking good questions, trying to provide value. That could take you a really long way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been really incredible to watch Brandon work and watch Brandon do his thing and slowly but surely just continue to build his own work. And it's a testament to the power of Twitter and the peer relationships that, I think of Twitter as like almost anyone could add any value or could add anything to any conversation. So in many ways, it's a peer relationship. And sure, there might be people who have, more followers than you or less followers than you, but anyone can communicate with anyone. And that's really rare if you think about it in the scheme of history. So I think it's definitely a platform that everyone should be looking at to maybe take advantage of.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, everything that you think you should be using LinkedIn for, Twitter is much better for.
Yeah, it's crazy. I haven't been on LinkedIn in so long, and it's because of that Twitter can replace that. So kind of switching gears a little bit is I wanted to talk about your reverse bet with alcohol, and you have to give Trump $100 for every time you take a drink from now until October 28th. Why was this something that you publicized? And I'm super curious about what you were thinking.
Yeah, I think it's like there's this weird relationship that I think a lot of people have with alcohol, where, me included, where it's very easy to casually have like a glass of wine or two, like almost every day. Right? Or you come home from work and you have like a beer or two to wind down, or you go out to dinner and you have a few glasses of wine or whatnot. And because it's such a socially acceptable and common thing, it's very easy to forget that like alcohol is toxic, right? There's no world in which any amount of alcohol is actually good for your body, right? There's definitely those studies where, drinking a glass or two of wine a day lowered the risk of, heart disease or whatnot. And I think most of those are explained by confounding variables. Like people who are having a glass or two of wine are probably a little more affluent, right? They're probably going out and being social and spending time with people. There's a lot of other things that explain it more than that this toxin is magically like good for your heart, right? That doesn't make any sense. So, the issue I run into is just like, it's really easy to get in that flow of, just like have a glass of wine at dinner or whatever. And then for it to like compound by hurting sleep over time, right? Because one interesting thing about tracking sleep really meticulously is it is crystal clear when I've had a drink or two before bed versus when I haven't. I can see it in the HRV data. I can see it in the resting heart rate data. I can see it in my body temperature. I can see it in like how sore I am at the gym or how well I can perform at the gym, right? Like all these little metrics that I track fairly closely that maybe a lot of other people don't track, I can see very clearly when I have or have not had alcohol. But, and I mentioned this in the tweet, there's this interesting mental dichotomy, right? Where there really is no there's no self, right? The idea that there is a Danny Miranda or a Nat Eliason is kind of a myth, right? You're this like ever flowing, changing personality depending on your context and your surroundings and your stimuli and your energy levels and all of these things. And so what I mentioned in the tweet is that 7 a.m. Nat and 6 p.m. Nat don't always align in what they want, right? So 7 a.m. Nat, who wakes up after having 2 glasses of wine the night before, is more tired, less energized, needs more coffee, is like not super happy with yesterday Nat for putting him in that situation. But that feeling typically subsides by the time you get to the late afternoon, and by 5 or 6 p.m. that feeling's totally gone, and then it's replaced with the feeling of, oh, it would be fun to go to the wine bar, right? And no matter how well I know that is going to happen, that does not change, right? There's always these conflicting personality modes. So the goal or the benefit of doing a public commitment like that is to kind of overrule 6 p.m. Nat, right? So I think if you look at the tweet, I probably tweeted it in the morning, right? Because what you kind of want to do is when you have multiple, mental modes or whatever you want to call it that are conflicting, and you have a more like long-term thinking, positive, beneficial mindset versus like a short-term hedonistic whatever mindset. You want to find ways for the long-term improving mindset to like overrule the short-term one. And a really good way to do that is public commitments to things. So, one benefit of having, the 20,000 some Twitter followers I have is that if I say I'm going to do something on there, it's like a fairly strong contract, right? Mm-hmm. And especially if it's something that I don't want to do and that I know most of the followers will not want me to do either, that's like a really good way to create buy-in. So I just put that out there because I was like, all right, I'm sick of, fighting with myself about this. I'm just going to create a public contract for it. And that's going to encourage the behavior. And yeah, it's been great. It's like, I haven't even really considered having any alcohol since I tweeted that. And even when I was like on a trip last weekend in a situation where I definitely would have drank a decent amount, anytime somebody suggested I have a drink, I would just tell them that they have to make the donation for me if they want me to drink. And then they were like, oh, well, I'm not going to do that. So like it also helped with the social pressure, right? Because that like with this habit specifically, there's always social pressure to drink from other people around you who might be having a glass of wine or whatever. And so being able to say like, all right, well, here's my phone. Like, if you donate $100 to the Trump campaign right now, I'll have a glass of wine with you. And they would say no, right? So it's really great for that too. So I'm very I think that there's this ridiculous myth that you should be this, super strong willpower, Jocko Willink, like iron will, and you should just be able to resist things. And I think that works for some people, but like, I'm a stupid monkey who can't do that, and so I'd rather like create other systems that enforce it for me because it's going to use a lot less energy.
It's really incredible, and it's so underrated, the power of accountability. And reverse bets are such a good way to just get yourself to do something that you're having a hard time struggling on with yourself. And I think alcohol in particular is such a social thing, and it's so easy to just have one drink and then you have the Oura ring and you see, oh my God, my resting heart rate went up 10 beats per minute or 20 beats per minute. I'm just like, how could I do this? And to say to myself, okay, not drinking and having that period of just saying no drinking, it gives you the freedom, the discipline equals freedom type of thing. Back to Jocko. It's like it gives you the freedom to then wake up and feel energized and just a total different mindset in how you're approaching the day. So I think it's really cool that you did that, and I definitely respect what you're doing and appreciate that for sure.
Yeah, I think there's other fun ways to do it too, because the deadline I set for it was my wife's birthday because I want to, be able to go out and celebrate with her then. But then the question is, okay, well, like what comes after? Because the election is going to be the week after that. So then that doesn't make sense. But I think there's other fun ways that you can spin it so that you can turn a negative thing into a positive thing. So one that I was thinking is like, okay, well, after this bet, I could do one where for every drink I have to spend like 20 minutes in the sauna or something. And if I build up any backlog of sauna time I owe myself. I can't have another drink until I've done the sauna time, right? So if I want to go out and have 5 glasses of wine or something, like, all right, cool, but now I owe myself an hour and 40 minutes at 180 degrees, which is like going to take a while in a bunch of different like sessions because it's really hot. So there's like other ways you can do it too that make it like a good thing for yourself.
Yeah, and I'm curious how you think about setting deadlines and setting dates, because from my experience, it's like I'll set a deadline or have a race that I want to compete in and then go in that race and then I'll kind of drop the habit after that race or after that deadline. But I also think it's useful to have short-term deadlines, because if you can have a short term, it's only 3 weeks away. Okay, I'll just do it for 3 weeks. So I'm kind of curious how you think about that, those setting dates when you're setting goals.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't have a good answer to it because I have this issue too, right? Where if I have a specific goal on a certain date, I can be way more compliant with like fitness training, for example. I think you used that example too, right? Like when I was training for the marathon earlier this year, I was running really consistently 3 days a week, lifting 2 days a week, was like not really missing workouts. And then as soon as that race was over, I was way worse at coming in and doing my workouts, even though I was working out fewer days a week and for less time, right? Like the commitment was easier, but I was doing it less because I didn't have that specific goal I was working towards. So there is this challenge of, as you approach a goal or, you know, something that you are using to keep you compliant, you have to find another one beyond it. Because otherwise you'll cross it and you'll kind of like lose a lot of your motivation. So in some ways you almost never really want to hit all of the goals, or you always want to have like the next one lined up or the next commitment lined up so that you're never like falling off the bandwagon. There's other things that I find help with this, like, you know, for seeing people, having standing events on the calendar is really, really useful. Like if you are having a hard time seeing certain friends because, you know, everyone's busy or whatnot, like putting standing things on the calendar makes it way easier to ensure that it happens. Like my wife and I have a standing dinner with another couple here in Austin. I have like a standing cold plunge and coffee on Thursdays with some people. There's, you know, finding little things like that you can work in help a lot, whether it's like being social, committing or completing goals, like maintaining good habits, any of it.
Yeah, I like that because it's a matter of really just making sure the process never ends and making sure that you keep going. And it's something that people who are goal setting types, you know, we reach and achieve something and then we're so happy on top of the mountain, but then we realize, oh, like it was actually the climb that was really enjoyable in that. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So kind of switching gears a little bit, I'm curious because you think about so many different things. So what have you changed your mind on? You cannot mention COVID in the past 6 months. And I say you can't mention COVID because that's the easy low-hanging fruit.
Which version of the COVID is the low-hanging fruit?
Okay, just take it away, Nat.
No, the only reason I ask is it's like I've been having this funny relationship with COVID where I was very early in trying to like make a big deal out of it. And I was like texting members of my family saying like, hey, you should go stock up on supplies and we should have a plan for like moving grandma somewhere safer and all of this. And when I started doing it, I was getting kind of like, not like made fun of, but there was this response of like, oh, it's, you know, it's just going to be like swine flu, you know, it's not that big a deal, you know, look at what the CDC is saying, like everything's going to be fine. And then, you know, I was kind of vindicated, right? It was like, oh no, this was a big deal. But now it feels like everyone is so terrified to resume normal life. And it does feel like you can have a mostly normal life if you just avoid a few certain kinds of situations. And now I kind of feel like the crazy person again by saying it's like less of a life altering. It's less necessary to massively alter your life than people think, right? So I don't know if that's what you meant about not talking about COVID, but that's sort of where my head is
exactly
at.
what I meant.
Like, yeah, I feel like I'm the crazy person again, but I don't think I am.
Yeah. So,
but anyway,
no. But so, just staying on that, it's so interesting because I've had the exact same response when it started. I like late February. I was really scared, but the point I'm trying to make is that it's fascinating because it speaks to Twitter's power, right? I think the reason why you had that is because you were paying attention on Twitter, and the reason why you think what you think now is because you're paying attention on Twitter. And if you pay attention to Twitter, you'll notice that the information goes faster there, typically if you're following the right people, than it does to the rest of society, I believe. And it's very fascinating to see.
And I think it's all about who you follow on Twitter, because you can just as easily be completely misinformed if you're following the wrong people, right? But with a well curated feed and with doing a lot of your own fact checking, right? Like I'd say a lot of my thoughts on it now come from reading as close to primary sources as I can and trying to figure out like, okay, what's the truth of this versus what's showing up on CNN or CDC. It's like the CDC and the WHO completely invalidated themselves as reliable sources of information when this thing started, right? Mm-hmm. Like basically saying that nobody should wear masks because it doesn't do anything, right? It's like when that was so obviously false, it's like, all right, we can't really believe anything else that you say from there on because you're just not a reliable arbiter of information on this stuff, despite that being like your one fucking job. But I think that like going back to your original question of like something I've changed my mind on that's not related to COVID, because we could talk about the COVID stuff forever. It's a good question. Changed my mind on. Maybe not changed my mind on, and this is maybe somewhat related to the COVID stuff, but I think it's different enough to pass your test here, which is people are generally very, very short-term thinkers, even when they're capable of long-term planning. So what I mean by that is, and I noticed this in myself too, but there was this kind of like temptation when all the COVID stuff was happening to assume that this would like just be life now, right? Like, oh, it's going to be, years before traveling is normal. Like, I'm not going to go out and socialize until there's a vaccine. There's sort of like this very, very morbid belief that like life just is this way now and it's like never going back to normal. And if you take like even 100-year view of history, it's pretty clear that we bounce back from things like this pretty fast, even if it's not intelligent to do so. And like human life is remarkably consistent following massive interruptions, right? It's like we've had plagues that were 10 to 100 times worse than this multiple times throughout history, and we still live in cities, we still travel, we still like go over to people's houses for dinner. We like none of those behaviors ever changed. I think there's a lot of stuff that's really deeply human or very deeply cultural that can't be undone from just a year or two interruption. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about more in the last month or two is, okay, most human behaviors that were normal before all of the COVID stuff are going to come back, but a lot of people right now think they aren't. So where are the opportunities to capitalize on that like short-term thinking so that you're really positioned to have like massive upside in 2 or 3 years when life is back to normal? So as a really simple example, my wife and I have been looking at like buying a condo or buying multiple condos downtown because like everybody's fleeing downtown and city centers, right? They think like, oh, downtown's dead. Everyone's moving to the suburbs. Nobody wants to live in high rises anymore. It's like people are going to live in high rises again. Like living in apartments is not dead. It's going to come back, and everybody who's selling right now is willing to sell at like a pretty steep discount to get out, and all of the single family homes are getting crazy expensive. So there's an opportunity here to, buy a condo, maybe lose money on it for a year or two, but then when everybody starts flocking back into the cities, do extremely well. And I think there's probably hundreds of opportunities like that are out there right now, where if you just take like a 2, 3, 4 year view versus a 6-month view, you'll see like how many things are going to bounce back in probably pretty remarkable ways based on all the fear that people have right now.
Yeah, and this was the biggest point I took from Morgan Housel when he explained how quickly airlines came back after 2001 and 9/11. Yeah. And you think about, what type of shock that, when I think of getting on an airplane today, I still think of 9/11. Granted, I grew up in New York, but the point is that people were resuming that activity rather quickly in the scheme of history. 2002 saw a slight decline, I believe, and then 2003 is back to normal, if not higher airline travel. And so the point is that, that's such a good point that we are even if you're a long-term thinker, you could still find yourself short-term planning. And it's like, if you can guard against that and create systems and create ways to guard against it, you're going to be in a great position in 3 to 5 years.
Definitely.
Yeah, man. So what I want to talk to you now about is you had a post in 2014 of some of your mentors in 2014. And I'm curious if you remember who those mentors were.
No.
Well, I'm curious now if these people are the same as they were in 2014. You mentioned Tim Ferriss, Seneca, Joel Gascione, the founder of Buffer, I believe. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Mm-hmm. And Kelly Starrett. And so, yeah, it was really interesting to see your perspective in 2014. And I'm interested if you still view them as people you look to for advice or look to them as mentors.
No, I mean, I think they're all certainly like accomplished. Well, Seneca's obviously dead for a long time. But I mean,
quite accomplished.
Yeah. I mean, for Tim, Joel, and Kelly, no, I mean, like, they're all obviously successful people doing their thing. I don't really follow any of their stuff anymore. I think that I'm like, it's interesting. I'm like less bullish on the concept of mentorship after a certain point in some ways. Mm-hmm. Like, I think it's very helpful for kickstarting something, but like mentorship almost demands a kind of like hero worship that will eventually disappoint you when you realize that like everybody is also like a faulty human like you, and they're not as great as you like made them up to be in your mind. Mm-hmm. And like realizing that can be very demotivating, especially if you like aspired to be like somebody who you looked up to really seriously. And I think it's tough to like keep a sober look at people who do have a lot of fame or a lot of success, and to recognize that like they're probably, making up a lot of it as they go too. And they're probably super smart and really accomplished, but also faulty in a lot of other ways. And I think the idea of having like the mentor in that sense is, it's great for that getting started. But then once you're over an initial hump where you can like make friends with people who are good at certain things that you can ask them for help and advice on, and where you can also give them help and advice, that I find is like a much more sustainable, healthy, long-term partnership than a mentor-mentee one. I do think that there is obviously some value in having people to go to for like questions and whatnot. And another friend of mine framed this really well recently, where he was like, a good mentor is somebody who has done the thing that you want to do before and can help you like cut out some steps. Whereas a coach might not have done it before, but has seen other people do it and has helped other people do it, and they can provide value there too. And so, there is a lot of value in finding somebody to help direct you on figuring something out faster than you otherwise could. But in many cases, I think it's just better to try to find somebody who can be like a friend doing that, rather than somebody who you have like this mentor-mentee relationship with. Again, after a certain point though, I think that it's really hard to take advice from people and just like follow it blindly, or it's not necessarily a good idea to do it, because, and I try to say this a lot too. It's like, I don't really know what's working and what's not, right? Like, I know that things are working, but it's probably only 50%. I don't know which 50%. And so if I was telling somebody to do everything the way that like I had done it, probably half of that stuff is actually like bad advice. And it's like hard to know which part of it is. And so it's almost better to like find a bunch of people to take ideas and advice from, compile it into something that like makes sense to you and for you, and then like follow with or lead with that and try to like kind of hack it together from a bunch of sources. So I don't know. I haven't articulated this thought very well, as you can tell, because I'm rambling, but I think I'm less bullish on that idea in general of finding a few people to try to model yourself after and then like following in their footsteps.
I'm curious why you say when you said if I give someone advice, it's going to be 50% wrong. Or could you talk a little bit more about that? I guess you're just not confident that what you did is actually the way you did it, or is it something else?
I think that, there's so much luck and timing and serendipity with success, and it's very easy to create kind of a narrative fallacy about it after the fact. Mm-hmm. And the reason something succeeded could have been totally different than what you think it was, and we're always going to be self-serving in our explanations of why things happened. So you could look at something and you could say, oh, this happened because I did this, but it could also be that it happened despite you doing that, right? Like, what's a good example here? There's sort of a common thing that a lot of new people in SEO will do, where they're like adding a ton of like metadata to their pages, like a lot of SEO tags, and really refining like all the H2s and H3s, and like adding keywords into the body text and stuff to try to like check all these boxes on an SEO tool. And a lot of that stuff doesn't actually help very much, and it's not necessary. And in some cases, it can actually hurt you, but you might succeed anyway just by having written really good content that you SEO'd afterwards. And so you could do all of your articles like that, and you could publish them, and you could rank well for SEO. And then somebody could ask you like, oh, how did you rank well in SEO? And the real reason is just that you wrote really good content about things people were searching. But you might say, oh, well, I really meticulously like added all of these keywords and tags and like formatted the H2s and did all of this. And then they would think that that's what they should focus on, not that they should focus on writing really in-depth, rich content. And so you've succeeded kind of despite you doing this thing that didn't help you. But then because that was the thing that you had more control over versus just like waiting and being patient, you've created a story of like, oh, you have this really robust SOP for success with SEO, and people should pay you $200 for it or whatever. And then those people end up not having the same success because you've like misinterpreted how you succeeded and what you did. And that's like an easy example for me because I know I've seen that happen a lot, like that particular one. But I'm sure there are tons of places where I think that something of mine succeeded because of this like really brilliant stuff I did, when actually it was like, despite some of that stuff, or, a combination of luck and timing and whatnot. So it's just like really tough to take advice and to just follow it blindly. And you kind of have to always ask yourself like, okay, did they succeed because of this, or despite this, or alongside this? Because some stuff will just be nothing, right? It'll just be like, it didn't even matter that they did it, right? Like a good example of this might be, somebody who's training for a marathon and then doing training for a marathon and then doing or drinking a lot of like what is that, liquid IV, right? Like that sugar water supplement, right? So then they're like recovering really well. And so they might say like, oh, well, this like liquid IV was like amazing for recovery, when like really it was that they had been like doing weight training the whole time. And so their muscles were able to recover better, right? Like, so then somebody else training might not do the lifting, but they might drink a lot of liquid IV. And then they're like, oh, well, like I'm, not recovering well. I wonder why this isn't working for me, right? Like it's easy to kind of misinterpret the roots of our success and then end up accidentally giving bad advice. So it's tricky to like try to weed that out and figure out what you should actually follow and what you should not listen to.
So the the thing that comes to my mind is like, well, should we then not give advice at all? And it's like there's a certain benefit, right, to not being sure and being open-minded about how you could have had success, but also being confident that you can give your best possible explanation to someone else, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think it's still worth giving advice, but I just always try to qualify it with something like that, right? Where it's like, I don't totally know what parts of this were the reason. And then, let them interpret it as they will, right? Like I try to be fairly like, humble or measured in giving advice on that stuff, just because I don't want to. I think there's like a lot of people who try to be gurus and represent themselves on experts and everything, and like they totally know what they're doing. And maybe they actually do, but I don't believe it. And I'd rather just like, be less clickbaity and try to give a more honest representation on what I think makes sense for me.
And I think that comes through in your content, right? And that is why I'm attracted to your content, is because you just come out there with honesty, and you come out there saying, listen, I don't know everything. This is what I learned, and does this make sense to you? Right? So
yeah,
that makes complete sense to me, at least.
That's the goal.
So I wanted to ask you kind of an odd question here, but I figured I'd throw it in. Maybe it'll get you to think a little bit. Is if you could get a tattoo of anything, but you were the only one who could see it, what would it say? I've never asked this question before to any guest, but I figured that you would have something interesting that would come out of this.
Yeah. Get a tattoo, but only I can see it. It could be of anything.
Such a thoughtful approach here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd probably be, so my wife and I are planning on getting tattoos, and I think it'd probably just be the same one that we're planning on getting, which was for my wedding vows for us, I sort of like the theme of it was that, one thing I really appreciate about our relationship and about her is that we kind of have this mentality that like whatever it is we're running into, like we'll figure it out together. And so we were both going to get tattoos that say we'll figure it out, like in each other's handwriting potentially. So I'd probably do that. I can't really think of anything else I'd want to get tattooed on me.
Your wife is listening right now, and she's quite happy that you mentioned that, I'm sure. So talk a little bit about that, about, you're 27 years old and you have a wife. Like, I'm 25. That seems crazy. Like, it seems so far away for me, but it's just a reality for you. How has that impacted and changed your perspective? I think you're one of the youngest people I know to get married. I mean, but you're not really that young. You know what I mean? So yeah. So talk a little bit about that.
I think there's a couple of things related to that. The first is, I think that especially for like young, high performing entrepreneurial-y men, there's this very common mindset of like maximizing optionality, and you might come at it through like finance, come at it through like Nassim Taleb, you come at it through blog posts, whatever, but it's this concept of like you're going to have the more options you have in your life, like the more successful you can be, because by not like closing off any of those options, you can jump on the highest opportunity things as soon as they pop up. And that's like a good mentality for options trading, right, in finance. And it might be a good mental model for like venture capital or something, but it's not a great mental model for like relationships or happiness. And that mindset kind of like triples over to those areas and manifests in unhealthy ways. So, one unhealthy way I think it manifests is this like desire to be nomadic or a digital nomad. And like travel around the world and work out of your backpack and like, hang out in Thailand because the cost of living is so low. And that's like really attractive if you've felt stuck in a location. I think everybody should do it briefly, but it's a very like empty experience because you're not actually building a relationship with anyone or anywhere. And I think the second most important relation, I'd say like the third most important relationship in your life. So like, top is obviously your immediate family. And then, second would be like your close friends, right? The people who you could like confide in and go to. But then third, I would kind of argue is like the city you live in, because developing a relationship with where you live is really important. And a lot of young men, especially who are kind of optimizing for optionality, are neglecting all three of those most important relationships. They're not committing to a city, so they're not actually like really getting to know a culture, a service community, a like lifestyle, any of that. They're not committing to deep relationships with people because, despite Zoom and remote work and whatever, you really can't make a deep relationship with somebody remotely, I think. Like you can get to a certain level, but you have to be in the same place to have a consistent, really like deep shared experience with each other. And then, the number one is like immediate family, or like most importantly, your spouse and your children. And if you're always optimizing for optionality, you basically can't have that. And if you're thinking like, oh, well, I shouldn't commit to a partner because like, a better one might come along, or, oh, I just want to like sleep around in my 20s and I'll like get serious in my 30s. You're kind of like missing out on what's probably one of the most, or some of the most fulfilling relationships in life, right? Which are like your life partner and then children. And I think it's, it's scary to like commit to one person because it means like cutting off all other options. But the only way you develop a deeper relationship is by doing that, right? Like choice requires sacrifice and investment requires sacrifice, right? Like a good analogy here might be that the highest option financial move would be to just sit on all cash all the time. But if you sit on all cash, you're never going to get any returns, right? Like if you just keep all of your money in cash, you're not getting any returns from the stock market. So it would have been better to just pick like any index fund and really commit to that and putting your money in it and get some returns than get none. And so I think that you're going to have a much more fulfilling personal life if you choose the partner that you really want to invest in a relationship with and then work on figuring it out together versus constantly searching for the ideal, like perfect out of the box partner or the ideal perfect out of the box city, the ideal perfect out of the box job, right? It's like the grass is greener where you water it, like not necessarily on the other side. And so if you don't actually pick things and invest in them, you're always just going to be like flitting between dissatisfaction after dissatisfaction.
Did you always have that perspective? And if so, when did the switch occur?
No, I didn't. And the reason I have that perspective is I was super into the whole like 4-hour work week, digital nomad, like solopreneur life, and worked really hard to try to figure out how to get that for myself. And I got it at like age 24 and like ran off to Argentina and was like living with my friend there and like hung out in Paris for a little bit and got to live with some friends in San Francisco and was like doing the nomad thing. And it like just made me really sad and lonely. Mm-hmm. And so, and I had been like in this, unhealthy on and off relationship with my now wife. And, I had realized that I was creating all of that like unhappiness in the relationship by obsessing over optionality and obsessing over like being able to travel and not being tied down to anything. And so after, doing that nomad time, I think that really changed my mind on it, where I was like, wow, this is like not a happy life. Right. Mm-hmm. And this is not like, it's attractive because you think that, oh, if you have the freedom to do whatever you want, wherever you want, with whoever you want, then you'll be happy. But that just leaves you kind of like empty and bored. So that really changed my mind of like, okay, what do I want to come back to the US and like commit to? And, she and I did something that I think every couple should do, which was we basically said like, all right, we're going to go backpacking in Asia together for 6 weeks. We're just going to stay in like cheapish hostels and basically bring like really limited amount of clothing. So we're going to be like uncomfortable on top of each other, really stressful travel schedule, changing cities every 3 or 4 days. It's like, this is the absolute like pressure cooker for destroying or fortifying a relationship. And we both went into it on the same page of like, okay, we're either going to break up during this trip and that's like actually going to be the end of it, no more of this on and off stuff, or we're going to come out of it and be like 100% committed to figuring this out. And we came out of it 100% committed. We moved in together like 2 weeks later. We got a dog 3 months later, and 2 years later got married. So it was just like being very intentional about choosing to try to invest seriously in the relationship versus just like waiting for stuff to happen, and deliberately testing it to see if we could endure like an extended stressful situation together before making a big move like moving in. I think a lot of relationships, Meg J has this great term in The Defining Decade where she says a lot of relationships, people just like slide in to each other, where they're like dating for a while and then one of their leases is up. And so then they're like, oh, I guess we'll move in together. And then they're living together for 2 or 3 years. And it's like, oh, I guess we should get engaged. And it's like, I guess we should get married. I guess we should have kids. But they never like do a really, really deliberate like test before making those decisions. So, you know, we did that really stressful trip before moving in together. We like did some therapeutic work right before getting married to like make sure that, you know, we were super on the same page about all of it, and, you know, discuss anything lingering there. Like, we've been pretty intentional at each of those stages, which I think has been extremely helpful and not something that I see in a lot of young relationships.
I think something that I would describe your life as is super intentional. It seems that from my perspective that everything you do, maybe not everything, but a lot of things you do are very intentional. And I'm curious what other areas you apply that to that you could expand on, because I think that there's a lot of value to be gained from thinking intentionally.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I don't know if I 100% agree. Like, I
just one man's perspective.
Yeah, well, I think it definitely looks, you know, I think I really am in certain areas, and then in other areas, I guess, you know, we have to define what intentional means, right? Like, I think I'm very fortunate in that I have the bandwidth to be very intentional in the stuff that I do, in the sense that, you know, between all my different projects, I have a lot of freedom in what I work on. You know, I can sort of write about what I want. I can sort of focus on the projects I want to do. And that lets me be very intentional with it, or at least, you know, try to be pretty intentional with it. But I'm also like, you know, somewhat impulsive or can make decisions really quickly. You know, I'm not somebody who takes a lot of time to really like iron out all the details on something before starting it, or, you know, really, really meticulously outline something before writing it. I find that a lot of stuff I prefer to just kind of like dive in and try to figure it out as I go. And that, you know, that works really well in some areas. There's some areas where it doesn't work as well. And so figuring that out has been like a good adventure and just like education. But I think that, you know, I try to be fairly defensive of like my time and energy, and that requires being pretty intentional with what you put that time and energy towards. So whether that's like being very deliberate about what people you spend time with, being deliberate about what like projects you put time towards, deliberate about what like information sources you allow to influence you. I think it's like, it's very worth thinking about how you want all of that like energy, mental resources, time, whatnot to be allocated, because like if you don't try to allocate it, it will get allocated for you either by people or your phone or whatever else can demand your attention.
Yeah, and it reminds me of something that happened to me when I was watching TikTok in January of 2020. I was just watching it nonstop, and I didn't feel as if I didn't have any intention of watching it, but then I kept watching it. And so I guess my question is, when you notice things come in and you notice requests come in, how do you navigate that and make sure that you are are doing exactly what you want to be doing? Is it just a constant process of reevaluating, of seeing like, oh shit, I just did something that I didn't want to do today, and so how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it goes back to what we were talking about with the negative incentives and finding ways to just like trick myself into being a better version of myself, right? Like the publicly committing to not drinking is a great example of that, right? Where if I know I'm losing time and energy to that, I'm not going to try to like force myself into changing it. I'm going to find a way to be forced into changing it. Or another example is I like to get up in the morning and read while drinking coffee. But if I don't put my phone on the other side of the room, that's not going to happen because I will inevitably end up on Twitter or something. Same thing for like writing, right? Like blocking myself from websites when I need to work on writing or need to work on something more deeply. It's like a very effective technique. So it's funny, I've like basically given up on the idea of willpower. I don't think it's a very useful heuristic. Instead, I'm much more focused on, how do I design the system around me when I am at my best so that when I'm not at my best, it's very easy and low energy for me to, behave as if I am.
And so how have you've written now, I think 200, how many medleys have you written? 230 something?
Yeah, 230 something. It's like 4.5 years.
How have you done that? Like that is a level of discipline and I guess not willpower because you haven't used that to do that, but that's a level of discipline that I aspire to with my own newsletter and my own projects. So what advice would you give to someone who is just starting out on their own journey of producing content and on a weekly basis?
Dude, that's a good question. I don't know how I've been that consistent with it, honestly. It's the only thing I think in my life where I am that consistent in terms of output. Because it's been 4.5 years and I haven't missed a Monday. I don't really know how that's possible, to be honest with you. But it's like it's happened and it's survived using like 4 different task management tools in that time and having 3 or 4 different people help with the uploading with it over the years. It's like it's stuck. I think that after a certain point, you just develop like a spidey sense for when it's not happening. Like there have been a couple times where it hits like 6 or 7 p.m. and I haven't even written it. And then I'm like, oh shit, I forgot to do that this week. And I have to like go bang it out. Or every now and then someone else will save me where it'll hit like 6 p.m. and they'll go like, hey, I haven't gotten a medley today. Are you sending it? And then it's like, oh crap, I need to get that done. So some of it is like being saved by myself and others. I always have a task to finish it on Friday, and I'd say that happens like 1 out of 10 times. It's pretty much always finished up on Sunday or Monday. But I think like, if you're just starting out and you're looking at something like that, it's really easy to get overwhelmed to think like, oh my God, it's going to be 2025 when I've done as many of these as Nat has, right? And that can be kind of demotivating. It's easier to just think like, okay, I'm going to try this for 3 months and see if I get to this certain benchmark, and then I can decide if I want to keep doing it, right? Like running time-bound experiments is very easy or is very helpful for preventing yourself from being overwhelmed by the scope of the whole thing, right? So I'm doing 2 of those right now, one being turning the medley into an audio version as well and releasing that on a podcast and saying like, all right, I'm just going to try this for 3 months, do an audio medley along with a written medley, see if people subscribe to it and are enjoying it. If they are, I'll keep doing it. If not, I'll just stop. And that's like a super easy experiment. I didn't want to commit to like doing it every Monday forever, but I can try it for 3 months, only 12 times and see how it goes. And the same thing with YouTube, right? It's like, I wanted to see what kind of engagement I would get if I started doing stuff there, what kind of growth I could see, if it's something that I could actually build out and that I enjoy doing. And I figured I'd just do it until December to start, see how I like it. And then I could, double down from there. And I find that's really helpful for me to like just run time-bound tests and see how I like allocating my time to those things. And then if it's going well, great, keep doing it. If not, like kill it and focus on something else. It's very rare that you'll find something that you want to commit to indefinitely. I feel like the only thing for me for that is like the writing. That's the only thing that I know I'll 100% still be doing in 20, 30 years.
Yeah. I think that's a very useful approach, and I've taken the same one by just trying to focus on putting out for my blog post, just putting out for a year, see what happens, and it gives you that sense of like, oh, if I don't like doing this or I don't want to do it after a year, it allows you the freedom to be like, oh, I completed what I said I was going to do, and that's super helpful. So before we,
test, right?
What's up?
Like you ran that test. Now you're not going to be wondering if that's like something that you should try or something you should experiment with. Like you've got that data and you said, yeah, you know what? I tried it. It didn't work. Like now I know. Now it's not like sitting on my someday maybe list forever.
Yeah. And that could be really, that hurts if you're, 60 years old and you're like, wow, I never did what I said I was going to do or wanted to do. So before we wrap this up, I wanted to ask you if you had any final pieces of wisdom you can give for the listeners of this podcast. I know you're a very smart guy who spends a lot of time thinking about just wisdom to distill. So if you have any final pieces of wisdom, I would love for you to share them now.
Well, thank you. I don't know though. It's funny. It's always harder to answer these questions than like when it's in a certain bucket, right?
What do you mean?
Well, so it's like when you ask the question of, and this isn't a critique of you, it's just it's a funny thing about human nature. Like when you ask the question, do you have any like parting pieces of advice? It's very hard for me to answer. But if you said like, do you have any parting pieces of advice about reading, right? Then I could think of like 3 or 4 things to tell you. You know what I mean? It's like
absolutely.
Adding constraints actually increases the creativity in a case like that. But in terms of like broad stuff, is your audience mostly like younger people? What do you know in terms of who's listening to it?
It's mostly my grandma and my mom at this time. No, but it's just really, really anyone will be listening to this. I have no idea what type of people will be. Yeah,
I mean, I think just like focus on your health first. Like if you can get that really dialed in, everything else gets so much easier. And I'd say like 90% of productivity is just being healthy and working on a problem you care about. It's like it's really hard to be super high output if you're always like tired and sleeping in and eating a shitty diet and your brain's like running on vegetable oil. Like it's not a good way to live. And so if you have to choose between like reading more or cooking more, I'd probably suggest cooking more, because that's actually going to have better long-term compounding than just like banging out more books.
I like that. And where can people find you to get some more Nat Eliason in their life?
Yeah, most active on Twitter. So just at Nat Eliason on Twitter. And then obviously I've got the YouTube that I'm doing a lot more on now. So if you just search Nat Eliason on YouTube, you'll find it. And then I've got lots of articles on my personal site, which is nateliason.com. But yeah, if you have any questions or anything from the episode, definitely hit me up on Twitter. I'll be most likely to respond there.
That was my conversation with Nat Eliason. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed recording it. If you have any thoughts about this conversation, let me know on Twitter at HeyDannyMiranda. I love the feedback, positive or negative. You listened this far, you deserve to give your feedback on the show. So let me know what you thought of the episode there. And that's pretty much it, guys. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. So grateful that you took the time out of your day to listen to this episode. Really appreciate you and want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Have a great one, guys. Peace.